Welcome back to Ray's Talk Show. This is your host, Ray Collazo. Thank you so much for joining us. Ray's Talk Show, we will not be silenced. Thank you again for joining us. You can check out Ray's Talk Show anywhere you can download a podcast, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, anywhere you can download your podcast, or just check us out at rayspodcast.com. Check us out on social media at Ray's Podcast. On this episode of Ray's Talk Show, we're going to interview the Pennsylvania State Director for Indivisible, Mikhel Harrison. We literally taped that conversation earlier this week, literally across the street from now the infamous Starbucks in Philadelphia that was the site of this horrific, really telling horrific incident that took place that led to the arrest of two black males who were simply trying to have a business meeting at a Starbucks like millions of Americans have on a weekly basis. And we talk about criminal justice issues. We talk about the ongoing efforts by the Republicans to take very cruel measures in our budgeting process to cut programs like SNAP, Medicaid, and other economic security programs that impact our folks and what we can do about it, and talk a little bit about what you can do, whether you're an activist, whether you're maybe someone that's involved in certain issues like immigration or the island of Puerto Rico, but you want to get involved in sort of connecting the dots on some of these issues that you're working on. And so we had a great conversation with Mikhel. So listen out for that in a second. And after you hear my conversation with Mikhel Harrison from Indivisible, I have a few thoughts about the power of podcasting. There's a sort of, for my money, a sort of a landmark event happening as it relates to people of color and Latinos specifically in the podcast space. It's literally happening as we're having this conversation. I wanted to make a note of it. But first, before we get into the political stuff, I wanted to share a personal story with you all, which really kind of, I think, is a great lesson for not only us as people of faith and but also just Americans just trying to get through the anxiety of this administration. And one of the best ways I can think of combating that scourge. So I spoke at a rally for the tax Trump scam in the Trump tax campaign that's taking place, which our friends at the Hub and the Not One Penny campaign and my day job, Unidos US Action, are and many other organizations around the country implementing. We're having hundreds of events around the country to educate people about the scam that took place when the new tax law was signed into law in December, what that law means for working people, and in this case, in particular, the Latino community. And I took my oldest son, Troy, with me, and he was very nice to sort of behave as I spoke at this event. And he joined me on stage, and then it was chilly over the weekend. So if you know Philadelphia, I took him to the Reading Terminal, which is just one of the great, I don't even know how to describe it. It's like a mall of good food, but just one of the great food markets for there's probably about 50 restaurants, and it's incredible. To say it's like a food court is not even doing it justice. It's just a wonderful, wonderful place for foodies to go hang out. So we went to go in there and get a bite, and I'm thinking he's going to be really focused on the chocolate factory that they have in there, or the big cheesecakes, or or how they make a cheesecake or a cheesesteak or something. And what he was struck by, and what he wanted to talk about while we were walking around the terminal in Philadelphia, was this young homeless woman that he saw as we walked in. And he basically purposely only ate a little bit of his grilled cheese because he wanted to basically give his lunch to this homeless woman. And so we proceeded to give it to her. And on the way home, he said, we need to do that more often. We need to, can we give food can we find young people that need food, that go hungry, that we can give money, that we can help? We need to do this more often. And so it was just incredibly humbling for me, because it was a great accountability moment for me, because I'm like, how many times, honestly, how many times we walk by a homeless person and just kept walking? And it made me think about how I have to check myself as it relates to, are we truly living by our faith and values? Are we truly our brother's keeper? Are we truly, am I truly standing up for the voiceless? If I'm saying I'm doing this on a podcast based on making sure that the communities that we serve and, our side of the tract, if you will, gets heard. Well, am I truly living to that, living the lyrics? So one of the things I did this week, inspired by my oldest son, was I challenged myself. You know what? I'm going to try. I'm going to do something for somebody every day. Something. And so when I put that in the universe, it's incredible what happens. I magically get, a letter from a company that throws events. I'd gone to a company through a Minecraft convention in the Philadelphia area I took my kids to about 6 months ago. And out of nowhere, they sent me a letter saying we're having a Lego convention and here's 2 free tickets. Now, we were busy anyway, but I said, you know what? This is an opportunity. So I ended up being able to share the 2 tickets with an organization that supports fathers reintegrating into society from prison. And so they're going to be able to pass those tickets along to a single father who's doing the right things now that he's out of no longer incarcerated, so he can take his child to this event. I had reached out to someone the day before who I saw was currently looking for employment. I said, give me a call. I want to help you. Not having any leads for this person whatsoever, but I showed that willingness and reached out because I have a quota. I got to do something for somebody every day now, right? And hours before I'm going to talk to the person to catch up, I get an email totally out of the blue about a job that's starting immediately that fits this person to a T. So while on the show, and we're going to continue to chronicle the nonsense, the attack on our democracy, the attack on our civil rights, the attack on the fabric of what makes this country great, and what makes this country the United States, we do have to take a step back and hold ourselves accountable to, are we truly living the life, and are we truly our brother's keeper? To quote one of my brother's hip-hop albums, are we truly acting and being actively in living in service to our brothers and sisters? And it's just incredible that this inspiration, this leadership, this accountability comes from an 8-year-old. And so I just encourage everyone to think about, what have you done today? If you're listening to this, listening on Friday, you're jogging, you're haciendo compra over this weekend, just think about a simple thing. What have I done something for someone today that's made a positive impact in their life? If I just given that little bit, if I made that intentionality of just doing that little extra to just help someone in some way, it doesn't have to be anything what's seemingly life altering, help someone take their groceries to the car, text them an encouraging word, something, algo. Doesn't have to take a long time, or you just never know what that intention and that effort of being selfless and servicing others, what it will do, and the power of that. You won't regret it. And it's also a lesson. Listen to your kids. They got a lot to share. So thank you, Troy. Thank you, my other son, Max, for all that you share with me and your inspiration and your leadership. I certainly learn a lot from them. as well. And so let's listen to another young person that I'm learning a lot from, starting to work with him in the last few weeks, Mikhel Harrison from Philadelphia, the state director of Indivisible, a very interesting grassroots progressive organization that sort of emerged from the resistance movement over the last few years. We get into it. It's a really interesting conversation. I think it's pretty straight up, pretty raw, as it relates to the thoughts of two men of color of not only this incident, but sort of how people react to it and how we need to address and speak our truth about implicit bias in policing, in general, and race relations in this country. And then I'll come back and share a few thoughts about the power of podcasting and a few other things on Ray's Talk Show.
Our white colleagues and just white people in general, they normally only get mad or only get concerned with this issue when the cameras are rolling. And, it's not surprising whatsoever to me. Just yesterday, I lift to work every day because, the parking here is horrible. And yesterday, on my ride home, literally, right across the street from that Starbucks, someone was overdosing. There was a homeless man, he was overdosing on the ground. And you can see his body was locked up, he was gasping for air. And, I saw, and let's be honest, it's part of the city, it's because this city is one of the most segregated cities in the country. I saw a lot of white people, and they were literally stepping over this guy as he was overdosing on the ground. I didn't see anyone pick up their phone. I didn't see anyone call 911. So I had to call 911 for my lift. And I mean, of course, I would have stopped if I could, if it was my, if I was driving my personal car. But that's just what goes on here. No one really cares about our community. They gentrify, they build our communities up, and they push us out. They raise the rent, and it's just they don't care. And unless it's recorded, or unless it's picked up by the media, or it starts to get that little bit of traction, they could care less.
We're desensitized to so many things, unfortunately, and I'm glad you brought that particular piece up because, as you know, from the sort of opioid crisis and this crisis of drug abuse and drugs being flooded in our communities. I mean, I literally remember the day I grew up in North Philly in the 80s, and I literally remember the day, Mikhel, when Reagan's people just turned on a switch and cocaine in those days flooded our neighborhoods and changed my whole life. We then had to be faced with the concept of, do we leave our community, and what does that mean for moving out, and family stability, and raising, sort of being responsible to our community. So it raises a lot of triggers. And the thing people have to realize is that, that Starbucks is in the shadow of City Hall, a city of Philadelphia that has one of the great, most vibrant and cutting-edge African-American communities in the country. And we don't have to go through all the dignitaries and all that history, but that's obvious. But at the same time, this being one of the most wealthiest zip codes in the country, and there being, although it's a small black community lives in this neighborhood, but there's the vast majority of people that get stopped by the police are African American.
For sure.
And how this is an opportunity for all of us, starting with a few of the brave white folks that said something in that Starbucks that day,
for sure,
to have a conversation about the implicit bias that exists, even amongst people of color at times, and we're just not. And our frustration of people like you and I is that when certain white folks can't even acknowledge that dynamic exists and is willing to just examine themselves, it's hard to move forward from there.
Yeah, for sure. And it makes, I think with that, people are afraid to examine themselves because it makes them uncomfortable. Once you have to confront your own biases, it makes a lot of people uncomfortable. But, we can't. We cannot progress until we have, our white brothers and sisters stand up and address those biases themselves. Just the other day, and I hate to bring Facebook into this, but just the other day I made a Facebook status and said something about white people being racist. And I had so many people, comment on it and say, I'm white, I'm not racist, or all white people aren't racist. Well, sure, that's definitely true. All white people are not racist, but all white people and all people have biases themselves that they need to face and that they have to confront themselves in order to grow and learn as a person, and to stand in solidarity, you have to address those situations. And it's uncomfortable. It is, because I had to confront bias myself. I'll never forget when 9/11 happened. And, I had bias towards Muslim people.
Oh, yeah.
And, a lot of us did. But
well, the dynamic there, Mikhel, was, especially for, in that case, non-Muslim African Americans and Latinos, is that this was an opportunity for, wow, at least the onus is off us for a minute.
Yeah.
And so that was an opportunity for, and there was some implicit sort of relief. And, okay, if someone else takes the heat for a while, that's okay. And we had to confront that directly, because that goes against the whole spirit of what we're trying to do in civil, in social justice.
Yeah, for sure. And, with white people in itself, and I've been, I just love uncomfortable conversations. But for them in themselves, they hate to be generalized. And for the first time ever, white people feel uncomfortable in the United States. And, they have to, they hate to be generalized. Like, when I say white people are racist, and, they want me to say some white people. Well, it's not some, it's most. Because if you voted for, this president, then you have
and that's the most frustrating thing, and I remember, and they released a poll, I forget which, one of the more reputable polling firms, the majority of white America is still with Trump.
Exactly.
Exactly. And you remember, after the election, the cable news is just fascinated with the disgruntled white person. They go to West Virginia with Bernie Sanders, or they go to Wisconsin somewhere, and there's white people sitting around going, well, we don't, he just said that. We don't really believe that. It's about illegal immigration, or it's about, people from the Middle East that are domestic terrorists, and all this nonsense. And so now that it's played out actually even as bad or worse than we could have anticipated, then where are they to stand up? So in fact, okay, and the people that are most uncomfortable are potentially some of the people that we're sitting around as we speak, because they see themselves as progressive. I bet you that woman that made that call at the Starbucks doesn't think of herself as a racist, sure, the way, a Klansman or white supremacist. But what she's not confronting is the implicit bias that she doesn't see in her day-to-day life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why, whenever I speak or post on social media or things like that, of that sort, I intentionally generalize white people, because it's about time that they deal with this. So many of them, get up in their arms and get flustered when they're generalized, because this is, of course, happening for the first time. But even like the Starbucks, it goes to show you that I hate to say this, but majority of white people have those implicit biases or are just outright racist. And where were these people when Donald Trump was generalizing Mexicans by calling them rapists? Right. When were these people when
that should have been the end of it, the conversation. Yeah. Like, why should only Latinos care? Like, it just doesn't make sense from a moral perspective. Why should only Latinos care if that kind of open racism is being discussed by a candidate for any kind of candidate, like, and that sort of speaks to the problem right there. It's like, it's like this selfishness, like that man that was having an overdose. Like, well, it's not my problem. So it speaks to a bigger moral issue that we have even. But you're absolutely right. Mikhel, share with people what it's been like working in this neighborhood the last week. Being in Philadelphia, there's been a lot of interesting conversations. We have African-American police chief that initially came out in support of the police officers. So I know in social media and amongst our circles, there's been a lot of interesting conversations about this incident.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll start with saying this. So I'm a former law enforcement officer, and so I can see both sides. And my parents are law enforcement officers. My twin brother is a police officer in D.C. My sister's an officer. So I can see both sides, especially being a black officer. This neighborhood, and I would just say the entire tri-state area, it has a lot of people bothered, a lot of white people bothered, and it's because that they're, we're starting to see, and it's playing out in the media, especially when you have, the king of all races sitting in the White House. They're just afraid to be generalized, so a lot of them are just, it's like walking on eggshells right now. And there are definitely the few select people that are standing in solidarity that understand, that are taking responsibility for this, saying, this is my community, these are my people, and this is what we're doing right now.
Mm-hmm.
And those people, power to them for standing in solidarity with all Black and brown people. But then you have the majority of them who are just trying to deny this as well. And as far as this week goes, it's been interesting to be a Philadelphian this week.
Yeah, and you do have to. It seems to me that the president CEO Kevin Johnson of Starbucks is making an honest effort. Through my work, I'm aware of some of the. He's a pretty progressive person and has done a lot of work in some of the communities we work with around the country to try to address some of these issues. So they're going to have basically a day of awareness to do sensitivity training and multicultural training. They're going to close their doors in a few weeks for a day. So those are the kind of institutional steps that we want to push, right? Ultimately, but it's interesting because I think it happening at a Starbucks is taking the conversation to the next level, because especially for the younger generation, there isn't anyone that hasn't been in a Starbucks and just sort of waited for a friend, mm-hmm. and you've started to see, just people across the board, including myself, that has done that a million times. And maybe I bought something because I know I was going to hang for a while, or maybe I waited and the person never came, so I left. And, we all can relate to that experience. And there's the idea that you would be kicked out, much less arrested.
Yeah, for sure.
And there's just these, and just confronting the fact that we would even have these double standards. I listen a lot to sports talk, and that's kind of I know it sounds funny, but I don't have a lot of opportunities to interact with white males a lot and have conversations. And a lot of these conversations come out in scenarios like we just had an incident with a guy that was just got on the Eagles. I think it was Warley. Basically, he got drunk, passed out on the side of the road, and got, when they woke him up, he got a little belligerent with the cops, and apparently he allegedly had a gun in the car, and he's gotten released, and that's the end of his football career. And, you get these white guys call sports talk, say, oh, good, get rid of him. I'm sitting here like, I've seen so many movies and been in so many, sort of like white comedies of Will Ferrell and stuff, mm-hmm. where white guys act do much worse, and it's funny
all the time.
When white guy, thinking about what's the movie in Vegas with the bachelor party? I forget what it's called, but
The Hangover.
The Hangover movies, right? So that's just so basically, white guys can act like incredibly ridiculous, and it's funny.
Oh yeah.
Where this guy, again, I'm not saying what he did was right, but they obviously had a bad night. But at the end of the day, passing out in his car, and maybe having a gun that may or may not have been legal. It's when I think of what are two of the widely held opinions of white males in this country is, I want my gun, I want access to my gun, and I want my weed. And so when black athletes, in this case, basically are exhibiting the same behavior, mm-hmm. it's punished. It's this guy's career is gone, and so this is the kind of biases, not only sort of with initial reactions to people, but sort of what's institutionalized, mm-hmm. that we have to confront, and we have to address the institutional biases.
Oh, for sure, and a lot of that's because in this country, Black and brown men and women, we are not just people. We are threats. We are walking threats. And, that just happened. That's just, every Black mother or father has that talk with their children and lets them know, you are not just a kid. You are a threat. And I know for myself, like I said, my mom was a police officer. And in her own district, me with my twin brother and my little cousin who was younger than me, this is the day before I started 6th grade. So I was essentially in 5th grade at the time.
You were a child.
A child.
Small child.
We had at least, I would say, 8 to 10 guns pulled on us. Because they received a complaint. They received a complaint for something. I guess someone was breaking into someone's car. And, us being 3 little Black kids walking around in a white neighborhood, they came after us. They came after us, and they pulled guns on us. And I was pretty short as a 6th grader, and that's just things like that happen every single day. And my mother was an officer in that department, and now that I think about it, she should have she should have been more pissed off, from that happening. But that's just because society thinks that we are a threat. And going back to the whole Starbucks situation, that all goes back to white privilege, and that's another thing that white people have a problem admitting and embracing, that they are privileged. You have a barista, and the 911 tapes were released yesterday. You have a barista that called the cops on 2 black real estate agents, and she used her privilege to weaponize the police and use it in her favor, to get them out the store. And you and I, we both work and did some political things. Like Starbucks, hell, that was my office.
Yeah.
For 3 months. That's where I had met, constituents, had one-on-ones with Starbucks. Now, thankfully, most of those people who I met with were white.
Yeah.
and I not thankfully. It's actually unfortunate. So I really didn't get bothered much, and I know, as a black man, how to take cover, and how to blend in, and how to find an area in the room, like in an establishment like Starbucks, where I'm not seen, or so I'm not essentially an eyesore.
Yeah, and that was part of the argument, right? Like, well, how come they didn't buy something or leave? And it's like, because they were just exhibiting behavior that basically every customer, and anyone that's part of the Starbucks culture, of customer culture, I mean, that's what they promote. People hanging around, people using their laptop, they have free Wi-Fi. I mean, they were just doing what, and the person they were meeting showed up.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Why did they have to leave?
And even with that, even with that, people who, they were exhibiting good manners, because when you're meeting with the client, do you want to be eating before they come in? Do you want to finish your coffee? Or
you wait for everyone to get to the table before you order.
That is manners, being a gentleman 101.
Exactly, that's right. Hey, listen to Mikhel Harrison on Ray's Talk Show. Mikhel, what do you hope comes out of this in terms of what people are listening to us around the country? Criminal justice issues, and not only racism but colorism. This conversation that we're having more and more in the Latino community about our skin tone being a direct, even amongst family members and colleagues, having different skin tones and how we're treated different, how we have to, acknowledge our privilege, in my case being a semi-light-skinned Latino, amongst the Latino community. What do you hope from an organizing perspective people should be doing out there, and what you hope is a positive next step we can all take together as a society?
From the organizing perspective, I think that, and if you're not engaged in politics, like you don't need to be, you need to have these conversations with your children, with your uncles, with, basically anyone. You just have that one-on-one conversation. And also, be unapologetically black, be unapologetically Latino.
That's right.
And just live your life in that way. I think that's powerful. Not many people know that. And even for me, I have one foot my childhood in the city in North Philly. I've had the other foot in the suburbs, and I know I had that switch going in between the two. And I know when I went to the suburbs and hang out and started hanging out with my white friends, they would say things like, oh, it's a black guy, like he likes fried chicken, and they would have those implicit biases, and they would make those microaggressions, and I never called them out. Call them out. That's right. It's okay to call microaggressions out every once in a while.
And people of color, particularly Latinos, have to do that.
Exactly.
Because there's bias with native-born Latinos versus the undocumented or immigrants, with the color spectrum. Mm-hmm. And so, those are things that we have to continue to do. The other thing, listen to Mikhel Harrison on Ray's Talk Show. The other thing related to sort of criminal justice issues locally, there was a ProPublica, an Inquirer article that came out last week that basically just did an expose on the fact that we have the most, believe it or not, considering this isn't, believe it or not, people, the Philadelphia district or region of ICE is the most aggressive in the country as it relates to apprehending and incarcerating non-violent offenders. So, nationally, even during the Trump administration so far, it's roughly 2/3 of the people that have been detained have some sort of criminal background. Whereas in Philadelphia, in the Philadelphia district or region, includes PA and West Virginia and Delaware, it's the opposite. The vast majority of people have no criminal justice, have not had much interaction with the criminal justice system. And there was a gentleman that lives up in Quakertown, not too far from here, that has now been deported because he had a couple traffic tickets. So even though he was married to a white American woman and had U.S. citizen children. So I was sharing with some people that I've never seen, and Philadelphia in this case being a traditional Puerto Rican Latino community, I've never seen as much visibility of ICE. Like I never even noticed ICE or DHS vans or trucks in my day-to-day life, frankly. And I see them all over the place, parked in North Philly, parked in Latino business corridors, just driving around. So there's not only sort of this criminality around, basically, even though these are folks that are mostly working in farms and just working people, helping build up our economy without being able to access Social Security, even though they're paying into it for us. But this not only just incarcerating people, but generating this level of fear in our communities with this building up this kind of military police presence in our neighborhoods. And I know that's something that you see in Black and Latino communities.
Yeah, for sure. And the past 9 months, I've been doing a lot of organizing in the collar counties, in Bucks County, Berks County, Chester County, Delaware County.
Well, that's where they're focusing their attention because the Philadelphia police aren't really cooperating them as much. So yeah,
for sure. And there, someone was also arrested for fishing without a fishing license and deported for that. And these are just non-violent. They're not even crimes. So I don't even want to call it non-violent crimes because everyone fished without a fishing license before. And there are programs like 287G out of the Bensalem Police Department. ICE tried to implement the 287G program, which basically deputizes local law enforcement officers as ICE agents. And my work as a former law enforcement officer, my department in Prince William County, Virginia, they were the first department to implement this program. Now, in that program, that was more so in the jails. So the jail officers, the deputy sheriffs, we dealt with the whole. We were deputized as ICE agents. Well, now they just implemented this, or they're trying to, in Bensalem, and that will be the first township, first municipality in Pennsylvania to have that program. And that just opens up the door. That just opens up the door for racial profiling.
That's right.
For deportations for traffic tickets, because if you're pulled over for suspended driver's license or maybe didn't pay a few traffic tickets, right then and there, that officer just turned that into an ICE checkpoint.
That's right.
And they have the authority to arrest you and detain you and then send you to detention centers like the one in Berks County.
And there was a law passed, SB 50, I think it is, in Texas that basically is going to free up sheriffs and even university security to profile Latinos. And, and there's a financial piece to this too. The article laid out that the detention center out in York County, which you do work in, we've done work in over the years, that detains ICE, immigrants with ICE in that ICE detention facility there. That community makes $20 million a year off those beds, off that detainment, utilizing that facility. So, and we know that the mass incarceration of African Americans and people of color is an economic boom for rural communities upstate. They always say going upstate. Well, and now the census has announced that those folks that tend to be from the inner city are now going to be listed for census purposes where they're incarcerated. So it's sort of like unfairly moving political power into areas, and then when they get out, they're not letting them vote. So those are issues that we're dealing with. And again, you listen to Mikhel Harrison. Before we go to the next segment, we got to talk about this tax stuff, Mikhel, you and I are working on together, and these potential budget cuts. Let people know where they can find you on social media.
Yes. So I do have a page that you can go and like, and that's Mikhel. That's Mikhel J, and then Harrison Harrison, and that's just me on Facebook. And then on Twitter, I'm at Jaya Mikhel. That's at JAYA Mikhel, and that's my handle for everything. Is at Jaya Mikhel. That's my middle name.
We're going to keep that conversation going on Twitter. I know you're a fire Facebook follower, that's for sure, man. You lay out some provocative stuff. So you and I met up this past weekend. We were part of a national sort of Trump Tax Day series of events going on around the country to highlight this tax scam, this bill that was passed into law in December. And we're starting to see it play out where working people and the people that sort of on one end are being told to be scared of us and that we're the problem. And now we're seeing that this tax scam is actually a scam, and it's just a tremendous amount of transfer of wealth to the upper 1% of this country. And then the flip side, we're starting to see, and the Farm Bill will be getting released next week, that there's potential for now the Republicans to argue, well, since now we have even a bigger deficit, we have to cut social programs for people that don't need it, or the unworthy. Programs like SNAP, rental assistance, Medicaid potentially, Medicare. So can you talk a little bit about why this is such an important, with everything going on, this focusing on sort of tax and budget policy and how it particularly impacts all working people really, but particularly people of color, is so important for us to engage in this process?
Yeah, so I'll just speak on Medicaid and the potential cuts to that, because Medicaid itself is the single largest provider of insurance in the entire country, and actually Pennsylvania itself, we are the number 2 user of Medicaid per capita, and this tax cut, of course, it costs $1.5 trillion to add that to the deficit, which my generation and my kids and their kids will have to pay for it. But with Medicaid itself, and I hate that they call this entitlement programs, and that's a whole conversation in itself. But for Medicaid, and what a lot of people have to pay attention to is that Medicaid is not just for pregnant women, it's not just for elderly people, it's not just for the severely disabled, but Medicaid itself puts over $84 million into Pennsylvania schools to pay for programs like one-on-one help for people with special needs, or for arts funding and such. And even itself, I had an event on Monday in Bensalem, and we had the Bensalem school district, 2 members from the school board there, and they're dealing with a $7 million deficit in Bensalem, and they receive over $400 million, $400,000 in funding for Medicaid in the district itself, and they broke it down like that affects class sizes, that's going to affect
the nurses in your schools.
Exactly. It's in itself, they like to say that there are really no cuts coming to Medicaid or Medicare, but where are they going to get the money from? They're going to take it directly from that, and they're going to cut roughly. That's going to cost $1.6 trillion in cuts to social programs like Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. And of that, $1.4 million of that, which is roughly 88% of that total cost, will come directly from Medicaid.
No, and think about so SNAP, for example, which is literally just putting food on the table for children and families. That if you cut SNAP 5%, 2%, 3%, that's one less meal for a kid a month.
For sure.
What's going to be the physical, emotional impact on that child? It's going to impact their education. It's going to impact their entire life. And then we see on the flip side this massive tax cut for the ultra wealthy, and we see them saying, well, Puerto Rico is difficult to get to, and a couple of the bombs they dropped on Syria the other day would have taken care of the issues in Puerto Rico and in Flint, which we're still having for the same cost. So the budget and sort of tax policy is really about our nation's morals and values. Mm-hmm. And again, if people aren't convinced, and because these are people of color, they have an agenda, they don't like Trump, he tells it like it is, like it's not that. It's pretty simple. Is that did the wealthiest people in our society need $1.5 trillion? And did we have to mortgage the future for our kids and our grandkids for that? Even if you would argue, and I've heard Bernie Sanders kind of break down the math of this, that even if you argued we needed to do that for investments, you could have used that money taking care of everybody's student loans, taking care of everybody's health care, and still had change to do economic development. So it's there's a better way to do this. And for those that are interested in the SNAP piece, and we're gonna next week when the House vote comes up, I'm gonna have we're gonna kind of take a deeper dive into the fact that SNAP's in the Farm Bill and kind of the machinations of that. If people are interested in kind of getting engaged in that issue, how do you recommend, Mikhel, people get engaged in the tax and budget conversation, particularly around SNAP? Because that's going to be the first sort of budget appropriation that happens in the spring.
So, these cuts are happening, and, unfortunately, a lot of people will wait until the worst impacts from it happen. And it's just important to know that, this administration, we can't afford to treat this like this is a spectator event. We have to get out, we have to be loud, we have to be vocal, and we have to use constituent power to counter all of this. And whether that's just getting involved with your local progressive organizations that are fighting for these issues, or writing a letter to your congressman, or getting out and knocking some doors for a candidate that will actually protect these programs and expand programs like Medicaid and SNAP.
That's right.
That's the only way that we can stop this. And this is a real danger. How many people know this? And for Medicaid in itself, this is directly going to cause more issues like homelessness. Because the first population that they're going to cut, they're not going to come for our kids first. Because that's just political suicide. They're going to come for the adults, like the adults with autism,
disabled,
the adults with so many other with schizophrenia, that are solely rely on programs like Medicaid to pay for their health care. And you're going to see these people on the streets. That's what's going to happen. And people think homelessness is an issue right now. Just imagine what it's like when programs like that gets cut.
Well, we just had a conversation as part of this tax campaign you and I are working on in the Latino Community Friday, and one of our executive directors of our community-based organizations mentioned that, and he's dealing with the displaced population from Puerto Rico. He said, if we're not able to provide these folks adequate housing, and then they're in the street, and then due to this traumatic experience they've gone through, which is now leading to homelessness in another part of the world, then it's just, you just know that folks turning to drugs and opioid and those needs are going to be exacerbated. So because we're not treating everyone's humanity the same, because of the case of Puerto Rico, it's not about legality technically. Everybody, they're all American citizens. It shouldn't matter, right? So that puts holes in that argument. That it's just going to create more of a need. It's going to be more expensive, and it's just, again, for people listening, unnecessary trauma to people. The SNAP budget is a tiny little sliver, less than 1% of this budget, and we have, we're spending almost $1 trillion a year on a military that, I'm not saying we shouldn't have a strong military, but again, 2 of those bombs in Syria could have dealt with many of these problems.
For sure. And I just like people to realize just the hypocrisy that's going on right now in this administration, because you're fighting for the little guy, or you run a message that you're fighting for the little guy, but yet, you're going to line President Trump, his family, they're going to line their pockets with an additional $11 million. The Koch brothers, they're going to make an additional $1 billion a year. $1 billion a year, and those tax cuts. Meanwhile, down the road, and it's not going to happen now, because that's where they get you. That's where they sneak it in. Mm-hmm. It's not going to happen now, but tomorrow, people who are food insecure or energy insecure, and a lot of these politicians that are lining their pockets with more money don't even know what these issues are. Look at the houses, some of the houses in North Philly, and even some of my own family members that are food and energy insecure, that don't have air or heat. Just taking money from them and just to line your pockets more, it's beyond me.
For people listening to this, Mikhel, that maybe aren't organizers like you and I, give them one tip. Give them one thing they can do when you say contact your member of Congress, or they may just not either have the confidence or even know who their members of Congress are. But give them a tip about what they can do today to get themselves more informed and make an impact.
One tip that you can do today is you can check out, like I said, you could put in Google, any of the organizations that you'd like to do. But I know for the organization I work with, Indivisible, you can go on indivisible.org and you can type in your zip code, and we are the most hyperlocal grassroots movement in this country, and the largest, and we have over 8,000 chapters across the country.
And Indivisible started basically as like a Google Doc to give people this kind of information. Who's your elected officials? How do you contact them? What are their social media handles? Because if there's a bad actor, I'm always telling people all over the country, particularly Latinos, like, I want Rubio to hear from all of us, about how he's selling out, our country by being complicit with this guy. So even if the person's not local, let's say you live in a community that has real strong progressive leaders. Most of us have a Republican somewhere, either in the Senate or somewhere, but you can still impact people that don't live in your immediate community.
Yeah, for sure. And for people that live in those red communities, you need to be calling the most. But for people, and
because it can change in November too,
for sure. And for people that live in areas like Philly or New York, what you can do is I know with Indivisible, what Indivisible Philly is doing was they're leaving Philly and they're going to knock doors.
That's right.
And in those red counties and the College counties around Philly, because in all those College counties around Philly, for the first time ever since the Civil War, Democrats are getting elected because people are waking up, people are realizing, and one good thing about this administration, I guess the only good thing about this administration, is that it's talking about these issues, because we are shook. We are scared, and if you're not scared, you should be. Because, the cuts are coming to these programs, and right now we're still riding the wave from our previous president. We're riding the Obama wave. And everything right now, for some people it's getting harder. But for the most part, we're still riding that wave. But once that thing comes crashing down, that's when it's going to be a nightmare for our country.
We cannot stress enough how important these November elections are. But on the positive side, the potential. So many of these districts are just assumed to be red, assumed to be, conservative, just because, we've just felt beat down, that we can't make a difference, that we don't have an engaged electorate. I was doing phone calls. A friend of mine was running for city council in Southern California in a supposed progressive community, and I was, through the modern tools, I was making phone calls for her from my house, 3,000 miles away. So, we can all make a difference, and there's so many important races out there. So there's so much power in all of us working together. And I think, Mikhel, I go back to what you said earlier, is that we have to be unapologetic about who we are. Exactly. And, that is going to make us all a little more uncomfortable, which is exactly where we need to be. Because, I know at the end of the day, there's a lot of, going back to the white people, a lot of white folks that they don't either believe they're racist, they don't want to be racist, they generally feel they want an inclusive society, they enjoy that interaction, but they just haven't had the space or the confidence in themselves to just take an honest evaluation of some of these biases. Mm-hmm. So we want to help those people, and so I think that the white students that are part of the Parkland movement, who have talked about, hey, we know we're upper class white kids and we need to, use that platform to give light to the African American young people that are dealing with these issues in their local communities through gun violence. And so, those are things we can do and continue to open up ourselves to help each other out. Mikhel, again, let people know where they can follow you on social media, and anything else you'd like to share with our Race Talk Show listeners.
All right. I'm on Twitter and Instagram and all the handles at Jaya Mikhel, at JAYAMIKHEL. And you can go to facebook.com/Harrison for Change. Again, that is facebook.com/Harrison for Change, and that's my page.
I love it. We're going to keep this conversation going. Mikhel, this will not be the last time you're on the show. Look forward to working with you on and offline. And thank you for listening to Race Talk Show. This is your host, Ray Collazo. We will not be silenced. Thank you, Mikhel Harrison from Indivisible. You're going to hear a lot more from Mikhel in the coming months and in the future on Race Talk Show. Young man's got a lot going on, and we're going to continue to collaborate with Mikhel. Wanted to share before we wrap up this edition of Race Talk Show. And again, you can check out Race Talk Show anywhere you download the podcast. We'd really appreciate reviews on iTunes or anywhere you download the podcast. Taking a few moments of your time would be very helpful, so we can raise the visibility of these conversations, because indeed the Race Talk Show community will not be silenced. I just wanted to share two things. One is, we have to continue to stay vigilant about what is taking place on the island of Puerto Rico. If you didn't see this week, they had yet another blackout, which lasted in some communities as long as 24 hours. There was several hours yesterday when I was not able to be in touch with our families. It was very ironic and very bittersweet for me as a big baseball fan that despite the blackout, which was impacting much of the island last night, they were able to play Game 2 of the Indians Twins Puerto Rico series, which took place on the island this week, because they, being Major League Baseball, they've got the generators to keep the stadium afloat, and it was a priority to get the stadium to power for the game last night. And while that's understandable to some degree, it's sad that this island, which produces, amongst other things, a great love and passion for sports and in baseball, and there were Puerto Ricans on both teams, including several star players like Francisco Lindor, Jose Berrios, which pitched a gem last night, and others. That this island is given so much to American institutions like baseball, was able to still give to have electricity for a Major League Baseball game on the island, while hundreds of thousands, if not over, maybe over 1 million Americans were without light. And we just cannot overstate this attack on our community and millions of Puerto Ricans, millions of Latinos, millions of Americans by the failure of leadership, because they don't care about Puerto Ricans, by the federal government. And, it's just the fact that, again, I'll go back to this example. If the state of Connecticut, a place roughly the size and geographically and similar population as Puerto Rico, can you imagine a scenario where there would be parts of the state of Connecticut after 6 months, 7 months without power? Would you imagine that 6 months later, through, no hurricane, no, just basically, lack of somebody screwing up, there'd be another power outage throughout the entire state? That wouldn't happen. It wouldn't happen. This president says that, Puerto Rico's far, but Syria wasn't so far to go over there and bomb the shit out of them. And with the money, with 2 or 3 of those bombs, they could have taken care of Puerto Rico months ago, and taken care of Flint, and provided more people with health care and other things. So, you can't be any more infuriated about it. If you're infuriated about it, you deserve to be more infuriated about it, because it is the classic textbook definition of institutional racism. On a personal level, it's incredibly sad. It's sobering, because it's like, then what do we do with the limited power that we have as it relates to changing the status of the island? We certainly can make more of an impact when it comes to the ballot box in November, when it comes to, economic empowerment within our own community. So it's not a hopeless case, but it is a crisis. And it is a crisis because the one thing I will not stand for, and I've said it many times on our show, is that, there are ethnic groups, the Gypsies, the Kurds, the Hmongs, that don't have their homeland. And it is slowly and now quickly being literally taken away from us. Whether it's the Bitcoin cryptocurrency vultures, the Wall Street broke vultures, the people that have an interest in making the island a big fucking sandals resort. It's our island's under attack, our community's under siege, and we're being displaced, like the people of Syria, like the people of so many other ethnic groups. And we have to continue to act as one. Kudos to our people that are fighting a good fight for Puerto Rico. So much good activity happening not only island but in the States, and we have to continue to support those efforts. The last thing I want to do is I wanted to shout out my fellow Latinos in the podcast world. If people don't know, for my money, one of the most important conferences that takes place in the Latino community, for the Latino market, Latinx market every year is Hispanicize. Manny Ruiz and his team do a fantastic job. My dear friend Calixto Chinchillas led sort of the film and Hollywood entertainment elements of that conference over the years. He'll be the 15th anniversary of the New York Latino Film Festival is coming up, which is Calixto's brainchild. So much respect to Calixto. But the reason I bring up Hispanicize, which is it's a conference that brings together Latino social media influencers with brands, and just a really important conference for have these conversations about where the intersection of our content, our talents, and the tech, this modern technological age are crossing for commerce and for good. But there was a workshop on podcasting, a very glam workshop. The legendary queen of Spanglish media out in LA, Roxy, one of our dear friends, Natalie Farfan from Morado Lens, Danny Vega Pena, the legendary podcaster from Gamertag Radio, and I don't remember the other names. They were the core panelists on this year's podcast panel. And podcasting has moved on up. I want to give a shout out to Arturo Nava, Felix Montelara, and others who were part of, and Arturo was really the brainchild of this initial session. That were the initial, we were part of the first workshop that Hispanicize ever had on podcasting several years ago. So to see it blow up as, from sort of a extra session at a conference at the end of end of a week-long conference, which still got a lot of attention, to be one of the sort of preeminent workshops that took place during Hispanicize with, some heavy-hitting talent, particularly Roxy, who's very well known, in the national scene, and people like Danny Pena, who's been on the CBS Podcast Network, and Natalie, our dear friend. It's just a great feeling, and thank you for the Hispanicize community for all you do. I saw great friends like Julio Varela, the Urban Hibaro, George Torres, and others get acknowledged and honored during the conference, and a lot of good people down there, a lot of good things happening, a lot of fun. I felt bad I missed it this year, but it just goes to show you that you have to trust your gut and you have to just take a step forward. When I started podcasting 5 years ago, I never met another podcaster. I don't think I knew anyone in person well that had ever listened to podcasts. And, and to go from that to, and probably never meeting another Latino in person that podcasted for 2-3 years, to go to that, to, Latinos in the Latinx community starting to be acknowledged for being in the podcast game. So really exciting. Much respect to our folks in Miami. I wish I was there. I know you're having a good old time. They're probably wrapping up. I can only imagine what do you do on a Thursday night in Miami to celebrate a conference? I can only imagine how much fun my friends are having down there. But we're gonna continue to have fun. And I put on social media the other day that with the 5-year anniversary of Ray's podcast, which took place recently, that I want to start having some live events. So look out for that. I actually may be having my first one in Florida. My Central Florida people, look out for me. Maybe having our first event down in Central Florida in the next 4 to 5 weeks. I'll keep people posted on that. And if you want to connect with Ray's Talk Show, you want us to have a live event at your community, email me, podcastrays@gmail.com. That's podcastrays@gmail.com. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, continue the conversation on social media at Ray's Podcast, on Twitter at Ray's Latino Talk on IG, and have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 76ers. Trust the process.